Did you know that in the vast majority of stalking cases ever studied, the person being watched had no idea anything was wrong until weeks, sometimes months, after it had already started? That gap, that blind spot between when something starts and when someone finally notices, is exactly where every single story I'm about to tell you took place. And what makes these three different from most stories like this is that I'm not the one who got watched. I'm the one who was doing the watching. So what does it actually feel like, from the inside, the moment you realize the thing you've been doing in secret has stopped being a secret at all? Before I get into the first one, if these uncomfortable, real kinds of stories are the ones that stick with you, go ahead and subscribe now, because there's more of this coming, and you won't want to miss it. I want to start with something I think most people don't really consider. How much of stalking, in its quieter, less dramatic forms, isn't really about a single dramatic act at all. It's about hundreds of small, individually forgettable choices that accumulate into something much bigger than any one of them looks on its own. That's exactly how the first situation I'm going to tell you about started. And it's exactly why it took me so long to recognize what I was actually doing. This was about 6 years ago. I was 27, working a job that had me out late fairly often, closing up a small retail store in a strip mall a couple of nights a week. There was a woman who worked at a different store in the same strip mall, a few doors down, who closed around the same time I did most nights. We weren't friends exactly. We'd exchanged maybe a dozen words total over the months we both worked there. Mostly just the kind of polite small-talk co-workers from different stores share when they happen to be locking up at the same time. That strip mall had maybe 8 or 9 stores total, most of them closing well before either of us did, which meant by the time we were both locking our doors for the night, the parking lot was usually down to just our 2 cars and whatever security lighting the property management bothered to keep working. There was something about that shared lateness, the 2 of us being the last ones there most nights, that made the whole thing feel almost like a private arrangement between us, even though we'd never actually discussed it, and she had no idea I was paying any attention to the timing at all. So here's a question worth sitting with for a second. How many small, completely explainable decisions does it actually take before you've crossed a line you never would have agreed to cross if someone had described the whole thing to you up front? Because I genuinely don't think anyone wakes up one day and decides to become the kind of person this story is about. It happens one tiny rationalization at a time. I don't fully know how to explain what made me start paying closer attention to her specifically, beyond the obvious fact that she was attractive and I was lonely in a way I wasn't doing anything healthy about. What I can tell you is that over the course of a couple of months, I started timing my own closing routine to match hers more closely, lingering a little longer some nights, rushing a little on others, always with the unspoken goal of walking out to the parking lot at roughly the same time she did. I told myself this was harmless. We worked in the same small plaza. Walking out around the same time wasn't exactly a crime. That justification held up fine in my head for a while, mostly because nothing about it actually crossed into anything I could point to as wrong, not yet. The night everything changed, I walked out to my car at my usual time and saw her a short distance ahead of me in the parking lot, walking toward her own car. Instead of getting into mine, I found myself watching which direction she pulled out, and then, without really deciding to in any conscious way, I followed. Now here's where I want you to ask yourself something. At what exact point does following someone stop being an accident of timing and start being a decision? Because I can tell you that in the moment, it never felt like a decision at all. It felt like something that was simply happening, one block at a time, each one easier to justify than the last. I followed her for almost 15 minutes that night, staying a comfortable distance back, telling myself the entire time that I would turn off at the next light, that this was the last block, that I was just curious where she lived and nothing more. She eventually pulled into a driveway at a small house on a quiet residential street, and I drove past slowly, taking in just enough detail to recognize the house again if I ever wanted to, before continuing on and looping back to my own route home. I felt sick about it almost immediately afterward, the kind of sick that comes from doing something you know crossed a line, even while you were doing your best to convince yourself it hadn't. I told myself I would never do it again. I want to tell you that was the end of it. It wasn't. About 2 weeks later, on a night I happened to be closing again at the same time as her, I found myself doing the exact same thing, the same incidental drift toward her direction, the same hollow justifications stacking up one after another, until I was once again parked a short distance from that same house, engine off, watching the lit windows for longer than any reasonable explanation would require. It was during this second visit that I first noticed the car. It was parked further down the same street, an older model sedan, positioned in a way that gave a clear view of both her house and, I would eventually realize, the spot where I had parked. I didn't think much of it the first time. Cars get parked on residential streets all the time, but something about its stillness, the complete absence of any movement inside it, despite sitting there for the entire time I did, planted a small, uncomfortable seed that I chose to ignore. But ask yourself this. If someone is watching a person you've been watching, who exactly is more dangerous in that moment? The person who's been doing this for months and has a pattern, or the person you've never seen before who shows up out of nowhere and sits perfectly still in the dark? I didn't have an answer for that question while I sat there. I'm still not entirely sure I have one now. I went back a third time, almost 2 weeks after that, the same pull dragging me back, despite every promise I'd made to myself in between. The car was there again, same spot, same stillness. This time, as I sat there in my own car, telling myself I would only stay a few minutes, I noticed the headlights of that other car flick on briefly, just once, then off again, as if someone inside had needed a brief moment of light for something, before deciding to go dark again immediately afterward. That single flicker did more to unsettle me than anything else that had happened up to that point. It meant, beyond any reasonable doubt, that there was an actual person sitting in that car, awake, present, and apparently engaged in something that required just enough light to need adjusting before returning to complete darkness. I left immediately that night, more rattled than I wanted to admit, and I genuinely intended for that to be the last time. It almost was, but 4 days later, walking out to my own car after closing, I found something tucked beneath my windshield wiper that had not been there when I'd parked. A photograph. Small, printed on ordinary paper, slightly creased from however it had been folded before being placed there. It showed my car, parked on that same residential street, at night, taken from an angle that made it clear whoever had taken it had been sitting somewhere nearby, with a direct line of sight to exactly where I'd been parking. I stood in that parking lot, holding that photograph for what felt like an impossibly long time. There was no note attached to it, no written message of any kind, just the photograph itself, which somehow felt more unsettling than words would have, because words at least give you something to interpret, some kind of stated intention to work from. A silent photograph just confirms a fact and leaves you to sit with everything that fact implies on your own. I drove home that night taking a completely different route than I normally would, checking my mirrors at every turn, half convinced I'd see headlights behind me, matching every move I made. Nothing followed me, at least nothing I could identify, but the drive felt twice as long as it normally did, every shadow along the road suddenly carrying a weight it never had before. I sat in my own driveway for several minutes once I got home, unable to make myself go inside right away, running through every face I could remember seeing in that strip mall over the past several months, trying to match any of them to the kind of patience this photograph implied, and coming up with absolutely nothing. So here's the question that took me a long time to actually sit with, honestly. If someone has enough patience and enough access to document you without ever revealing themselves, what does that tell you about how long they'd actually been watching before you ever noticed them at all? I never went back to that street again. I never approached the woman from the other store to explain or apologize, partly out of shame, partly out of a genuine fear that doing so would somehow make things worse, would put me on record in some way as the person responsible for whatever had been happening on that street, regardless of whether the photograph had come from someone protecting her or someone with entirely different motives of their own. I quit that job about a month later, for reasons I told my manager had nothing to do with any of this, which was technically true in the sense that I never explained the actual reason to anyone. I never found out who took that photograph, whether it was someone watching out for her safety who had simply identified me as a threat worth documenting, or someone else entirely whose presence on that street had nothing to do with protecting anyone and everything to do with their own version of exactly what I had been doing. For a long time after I left that job, I found myself avoiding that entire stretch of road whenever I had to drive anywhere near it, taking a longer route just to keep that strip mall and that residential street completely out of my path. It felt irrational even while I was doing it, given how many months had passed and how little chance there was of running into anyone connected to any of it. But the avoidance had less to do with logic and more to do with a kind of physical aversion that had settled into me, the way your body sometimes refuses certain places long after your mind has decided there's nothing left to fear there. I think about that flicker of headlights more than almost anything else from that entire period. One brief flash of light in an otherwise still, dark car on a street where I had no business being, that told me, more clearly than any words could have, that I was not the only person paying attention to things I had no right to be paying attention to. The second story took place a couple of years later, and it involves something that I think most people would find even harder to admit to than the first one, because there was no single moment where I actively decided to start. It just sort of built itself, the way mold builds in a corner you stop checking. Here's a question for you before I get into it. Do you think it's worse to do something invasive on purpose, in a single deliberate moment, or to slide into the exact same behavior so gradually that you never actually have to make a real decision about it at all? I've gone back and forth on that question more times than I can count, and I still don't have a clean answer. I had moved into a new apartment complex, the kind with several buildings arranged around a shared courtyard, close enough to several neighboring units that you could often hear bits of other people's lives without trying to. A television through a wall, a conversation carried on a balcony, that kind of low-level overlap that comes with apartment living. I want to be honest that I found something appealing about that overlap almost immediately, a kind of passive access to other people's ordinary routines that I didn't examine too closely at the time. There was a unit across the courtyard from mine, close enough that on warm evenings, when both of our windows were open, I could occasionally hear fragments of conversation or music drifting across the open space between us. I started, without deciding to in any deliberate way, paying closer attention to that particular unit specifically, noticing patterns in when the lights came on, when they went off, the general rhythm of whoever lived there. It escalated slowly, from simply noticing to actively positioning myself to notice better. I started sitting on my own small balcony in the evenings more often than I used to, with a clear line of sight across the courtyard, telling myself I just liked the fresh air, which was true, but incomplete as an explanation for how specifically I'd angled my chair. I even bought a slightly better outdoor chair at one point, telling the version of myself doing the shopping that it was simply more comfortable than my old one, while the version of myself who actually angled it every evening knew exactly why the extra width and the particular recline mattered for sitting out there longer, without it becoming obvious that I was doing anything other than relaxing. I think back on that purchase now more than almost any other detail from this whole period, because it represents exactly the kind of quiet, deliberate investment a person makes in a habit they've already decided, somewhere beneath their own conscious awareness, that they have no intention of giving up anytime soon. Over the course of several months, I built up a fairly detailed, completely unauthorized understanding of the daily rhythm of whoever lived in that unit, though I never actually learned their name or saw them clearly enough to recognize on the street. I knew roughly when they came home most evenings. I knew they tended to have the same few songs playing through open windows on weekend afternoons. I knew, in the kind of intimate detail that comes only from sustained, quiet observation, things about a stranger's life that I had absolutely no right to know. Think about that for a second. How much do you actually know about the people who live closest to you? The ones whose windows you can see from your own home, without ever having had a single real conversation with them. Most people would say almost nothing. I knew enough to feel, in some twisted way, like I had a relationship with a person who had no idea I existed. The first sign that something had shifted came on an ordinary Tuesday evening. I was on my balcony, in my usual spot, when I noticed that the blinds across the courtyard, which were almost always left slightly open in a way that allowed exactly the kind of casual viewing I'd been doing for months, were instead pulled completely shut. Not unusual on its own. People close their blinds, but it stayed that way the next night too, and the night after that, a level of consistency that felt different from the occasional closed blind I'd seen before during normal fluctuations in someone's routine. About a week into this change, I came home one evening to find a small sticky note attached to my own door, at eye level, impossible to miss. It read simply, "The view goes both ways." I stood in that hallway holding that note for a long time, feeling something cold settle into my chest that I hadn't experienced before during any of this. Because that sentence meant they knew, not suspected, not wondered, knew, specifically, and with enough confidence to write it down and tape it directly to my door, rather than simply closing their blinds and letting the matter end there quietly. I went back inside my own apartment that night and sat in the dark for a long time without turning any lights on, which felt like an oddly fitting response given everything that note implied. I kept thinking about every single evening I'd spent on that balcony, trying to recall whether I'd ever caught even a glimpse of someone watching me back. Any flicker of movement in those windows directed at my side of the courtyard, rather than the other way around. I couldn't recall a single instance. Whoever had been aware of what I was doing had apparently managed to observe me just as thoroughly as I'd been observing them, without ever once giving themselves away in all those months, which meant they had either far more patience than I did, or simply far more discretion about how they used it. So here's a question I still can't fully answer. Why write a note at all? Why not simply close the blinds permanently and let the watching quietly end on its own? What does it say about a person that they wanted me to know, specifically, that I had been caught, rather than just removing the opportunity and walking away? I never figured out who had written it, whether it was the person from that unit themselves, confronting me in the most minimal way possible, or someone else entirely, who had simply noticed my pattern of sitting on that balcony every evening and decided to point out what I clearly hadn't realized was so obvious from the outside. Either way, I stopped sitting out there in the evenings, almost entirely after that note appeared, and within a few months, I had moved out of that complex altogether, telling myself it was for unrelated reasons, even though I knew, somewhere underneath that explanation, exactly what had actually driven the decision. If you've ever been on the other side of something like this, the person who noticed someone watching and had to decide how to handle it, I'd actually like to hear how you chose to respond. Drop a comment and let me know, because I think there's a whole side to these stories that almost never gets told, the perspective of the person who caught on and quietly did something about it, rather than simply living with the discomfort. The third story is the one I've sat with the longest before deciding to share it, mostly because of how directly it ties back to a job I held for several years, one I genuinely needed and couldn't easily afford to lose, which is part of why I kept doing what I was doing for as long as I did, despite every internal warning sign telling me I should stop. Before I get into this last one, here's something worth thinking about. How many strangers walk through your backyard, your side gate, places you'd never normally let anyone go, as part of completely routine, legitimate jobs you've never once questioned? Meter readers, delivery drivers cutting through to a side door, inspectors. We give a surprising number of strangers brief, unsupervised access to the edges of our private lives every single month. and most of us never think twice about what that access could be used for beyond its intended purpose. I worked for a time as a meter reader for a regional utility company, a job that required going onto private property, usually side yards or backyards, to physically check meters on a rotating monthly schedule. The job gave me legitimate access to spaces most people would never otherwise let a stranger into, brief windows of time, usually unsupervised, walking through yards and occasionally getting close enough to windows to see inside without anyone realizing exactly how much could be glimpsed during a routine that was supposed to take less than 2 minutes per property. The job itself covered a rotating route of a few hundred properties spread across several neighborhoods, which meant I rarely visited the exact same house more than once a month, giving most of those visits a kind of anonymity baked right into the structure of the work. Nobody expected to see the same meter reader's face often enough to remember it clearly, and most homeowners weren't even home when I came through, since the whole point of the job was efficiency, getting in and out without needing anyone present at all. That anonymity, more than anything else, is probably what let this particular habit take root as easily as it did, because there was almost no social friction reminding me, visit after visit, that actual people lived behind those windows. I started, gradually, letting some of those visits run longer than they needed to, lingering near windows that happened to have a clear view into a kitchen or living room, telling myself I was simply double-checking a meter reading or dealing with some minor obstruction, when really, I was using the legitimate cover of my job to look into people's homes in a way that had nothing to do with utility readings at all. There was one particular property, a house on a quiet street, that was part of my regular rotation, where I started doing this more consistently than anywhere else on my route, mostly because the layout of the backyard put the meter in a spot with an unusually clear view directly into a back room through a large window that was rarely covered. This went on for several months before anything changed. The change, when it came, was small enough that I almost missed its significance entirely. I arrived for a routine reading and found that the meter itself, which was usually mounted in an easily accessible spot, had a small padlock attached to its protective cover, something I had genuinely never seen before in all my time doing that job. It wasn't preventing me from doing the actual reading, since the readout was still visible through a small window in the cover, but it was clearly a deliberate addition, something the homeowner had installed recently and specifically. Ask yourself this: if you suddenly noticed someone had added a lock to something that never needed one before, right around the time you'd started lingering somewhere you shouldn't have, would you read that as a coincidence? Or would some part of you already know exactly what it meant? I didn't think much of it that first time, assuming it might simply be a precaution against tampering that had nothing to do with me specifically. But on my next scheduled visit a month later, I found a second addition, a small weatherproof sign, zip-tied directly to the meter housing itself, with a short message printed on it in plain block lettering. It said, "Smile, you're on camera." I remember standing there reading that sign 2 or 3 times over, as if rereading it might somehow change what it said. There's a particular kind of stillness that settles into your body when you realize a message was written specifically for you, even when your name isn't on it, even when the person who wrote it never saw your face clearly enough to describe you to anyone else. The sign didn't need my name. It only needed to exist in that exact spot, at that exact height, facing the exact direction I always stood when I lingered there, for me to understand immediately and completely that it was meant for me and no one else. I looked around that backyard immediately, scanning every angle I could think of, the eaves of the house, the fence line, anywhere a camera might plausibly be mounted. I didn't see one, though that proved nothing given how small and well-concealed modern cameras can be. What I did notice, for the first time despite having stood in that exact spot more times than I wanted to admit, was that the window I had spent so many of those previous visits lingering near now had a thin strip of reflective film applied along its lower edge, the kind that allows someone inside to see out clearly while making it significantly harder to see in. I finished that reading as quickly as I possibly could, and left without lingering anywhere near that window for even a second longer than necessary. I requested, the following week, through channels that didn't require me to explain my actual reasoning, that my route be adjusted to exclude that property going forward, citing a vague personal conflict that nobody questioned closely enough to push back on. I never learned whether that homeowner had actually installed a camera or whether the sign alone had been the entire strategy, a deterrent built purely on the assumption that anyone behaving the way I had been would react exactly the way I did, with immediate, guilty retreat the moment the possibility of being recorded became real rather than theoretical. Either way, it worked completely. I never went near that property again, and the experience changed, in a more lasting way than I expected, how comfortable I felt lingering anywhere near a window during the remainder of my time in that job. I left that position entirely about a year later, for reasons that had genuinely nothing to do with this specific incident, though I won't pretend the discomfort of it didn't follow me through every subsequent route and every subsequent house with a window positioned just a little too conveniently for a meter reader with too much time and too little discipline about how he used it. So here's the last question I want to leave you with, because I think it's the one that actually matters most out of everything in these three stories. If three completely different people, in three completely different situations, all landed on the exact same strategy when they realized they were being watched, quiet proof instead of confrontation, what does that tell you about what actually stops someone like me, the person doing the watching, more effectively than any direct accusation ever could? What strikes me most, looking back across all three of these situations now, years removed from each of them, is how consistently the response to my own behavior came not through confrontation, not through shouting or police involvement, or anything dramatic enough to give me a clear villain to be afraid of, but through quiet, deliberate signals designed to do exactly one thing: make me understand, unmistakably, that I had been seen the entire time I'd convinced myself I was invisible. A photograph under a windshield wiper, a note on a door, a sign zip-tied to a meter. Three completely different situations, three completely different people, and yet every single one of them landed on almost the exact same strategy. Because I think, on some level, they all understood the same basic truth. You don't need to threaten someone to make them stop watching. You just need to prove to them that the watching was never as secret as they assumed. I've thought a lot, in the years since all three of these happened, about why that particular approach works as effectively as it does, at least on someone like the version of myself in these stories. I think it's because confrontation gives you something to push back against. If someone yells at you, or calls the police, or shows up at your door demanding an explanation, there's a kind of clarity to that, an opponent you can understand and respond to, even if your response is simply guilt and retreat. But a quiet piece of evidence, left without explanation, without anger, without any demand for a response at all, doesn't give you anything to push against. It just sits there, undeniable, forcing you to sit with the full weight of what you did entirely on your own, with no one else's reaction to distract you from it. I don't know if any of the three people behind these three signals ever thought about it in those terms. I suspect, honestly, that most of them were simply doing whatever felt right in the moment, protecting themselves or their privacy in whatever way occurred to them first. But whatever the intention behind each one, the effect on me was identical every single time. Immediate, complete withdrawal, the kind that no warning or threat had ever managed to produce in any other part of my life up to that point. If you've made it this far, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is wherever you are right now. I'm always curious how many of you are watching these late at night versus during the day. And either way, if you want more of these real, uncomfortable stories without anything supernatural attached to them, make sure you're subscribed, because there's always another one waiting.